My parents handed my sister $1 million for her dream business, called me wasted space, and threw me out with $300. And 5 years later, she showed up broken outside the beachfront villa I built from nothing. "You're just wasting space here, Owen." My dad said it flat, like he'd rehearsed it in the mirror that morning. My mom didn't look up from her coffee. My sister Priscilla sat at the head of the table grinning because dad had just wired her $1 million from his retirement account. He printed the confirmation page like it was a diploma. "We believe in you," he told her, beaming, sliding the paper across the table so she could admire it again. I stood by the door with a duffel bag half zipped, watching my family toast a woman who'd flunked out of college twice. I'd dropped out once myself at 20 to help cover the mortgage the year dad's contracting business nearly folded. That apparently made me the failure in this house. When I asked quietly, "What about me?" my dad didn't even blink. "Time to be a man, Owen. What are you even doing with your life? Saving?" He said saving like it was a joke. Like ambition without a business plan attached wasn't worth acknowledging. My mother finally looked up, not at me, at the clock on the wall, like she was checking how much longer this would take. Priscilla didn't look up at all. She was already texting someone about interior designers for the boutique. I picked up my bag. My father counted out $300 from his wallet, folded it once, and set it on the counter like a tip. "For gas," he said. "Find your own way from here." I took the money because I needed it. I walked out the front door of the only house I'd ever lived in, and nobody followed me to say goodbye properly. I was 26 years old the night that happened, and I want to back up, because none of this makes sense without understanding what our house actually was before that dinner. My name is Owen Bellamy. I grew up in Wilmington, North Carolina, in a modest two-story on Greenridge Lane that my parents, Harold and Denise, bought the year I was born. Priscilla came 4 years after me. From the beginning, the math in that house never balanced evenly between us, and I don't say that out of bitterness now. I say it because it's simply what happened, verifiable year after year. Priscilla was diagnosed with a mild learning difference in 3rd grade, and my parents responded to that diagnosis by treating her, for the rest of her life, like glass that might crack under any expectation at all. I don't blame a child for that. I blame the adults who never let her grow out of the treatment once she became an adult herself. By the time she was 17, she understood instinctively that struggling got her resources and succeeding got her ignored. She wasn't calculating about it, not yet. It was simpler than that. It was just how the house worked, and she was smart enough to feel the current, even if she never named it. I worked. That's really the short version of my adolescence. I bagged groceries at 16 at the Harris Teeter off Oleander Drive. I mowed 6 lawns a week the summer I was 17. When I got into North Carolina State for computer science, my parents were proud in the distant way people are proud of things that don't cost them anything. 2 years in, my dad's business hit a wall, a bad commercial contract that went unpaid, and the mortgage on Greenridge Lane started slipping behind. I withdrew from state in my sophomore year, moved home, took a job at a call center, and handed over $400 a month for 14 months straight until the business stabilized. Nobody printed a confirmation page for that. Nobody called a family meeting to celebrate the son who kept the roof over their heads. It was simply expected, quietly absorbed into the machinery of the household, and never mentioned again once the crisis passed. Priscilla, meanwhile, enrolled at a small private college in Charlotte, the same year I dropped out, on a tuition package my parents had been saving toward since she was born, a separate account, I'd later learn, that had never existed for me. She lasted 3 semesters before withdrawing, citing burnout. My parents called it a gap year and helped her find an apartment. 18 months later, she enrolled again, a different school, a design program this time, and lasted 2 semesters before that one also fell apart, this time over what she described as toxic professors. Twice flunked in the plainest terms, though our house never used that word out loud. There's a specific memory that reads now as pure foreshadowing, though at the time, I filed it away as nothing. I was 23. Priscilla, 19, asked to borrow my car for a weekend to visit a friend in Raleigh. I said yes. She returned it 4 days late with 1/8 of a tank and a long scratch down the passenger door she never mentioned. When I asked about it, she said, "God, it's just a car, Owen. Why do you care so much about stuff?" My father, overhearing, told me I was being materialistic for being upset. That was the pattern in miniature. Priscilla takes something, damages it, denies responsibility, and I become the villain for noticing. I didn't have language for that pattern yet. I would eventually have a great deal of language for it. By the time I was 26, I'd built a small freelance web development business out of my childhood bedroom, working nights, saving aggressively, sketching out an idea for a scheduling software product aimed at independent contractors, something I understood intimately from years of watching my dad's business drown in paperwork. I had $11,000 saved, which felt like a fortune and also nothing at all. That was the year Priscilla announced her boutique idea, a candle and home goods store she wanted to call Ember and Oak. And that was the year my father, without a single conversation with me about business models or timelines or risk, wired her $1 million from an inheritance he'd received after my grandfather's death 8 months earlier. Money that, by any reasonable accounting, belonged equally to both of us as his children. Money he never once mentioned existed until the night he handed nearly all of it to my sister and told me I was wasting space in his house. I left with $300, a duffel bag, and a laptop with $41 in my checking account beyond that. I want to be clear about what the next stretch of my life actually looked like, because it matters for everything that came after. I slept in my car near Wrightsville Beach for the first 6 weeks because parking there was free overnight if you moved before 6 a.m. I got a trial membership at a Planet Fitness on Market Street specifically because it had showers, and I stretched that trial period by canceling and re-signing under a slightly different email twice before a manager finally caught on and let me keep coming anyway, out of what I can only assume was pity. I worked warehouse overnight shifts loading delivery trucks for $11 an hour, and every morning after my shift ended at 6, I sat on the seawall with a laptop balanced on my knees and built my scheduling software, line by line, sunrise after sunrise, while gulls fought over trash near the pier. My parents, meanwhile, threw Priscilla a launch party for Ember and Oak that made the local paper's small business section. My mother posted photos captioned, "So proud of my girl." Nobody asked where I was living. Nobody called to check. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. It took me 14 months of that warehouse and seawall routine before my scheduling software, which I'd eventually named Ledger Flow, got its first paying client, a plumbing contractor in Myrtle Beach, who paid me $200 a month to use it for his 6-man crew. I still remember exactly what that felt like. The first time money came in that I had built entirely with my own hands, owed to no one, expected by no one. Within 18 months, I had 40 small contracting businesses paying subscriptions. Within 3 years, I had 400, a small team of 6 people, and an office above a surf shop on Lumina Avenue. By year 5, Ledger Flow had been quietly acquired in part by a larger logistics software company for a sum that let me pay off every debt I'd ever carried and buy, outright, a 4-bedroom beachfront villa in a gated community just south of Wrightsville, the kind of house with a name plaque out front and a private boardwalk to the sand. I want to be honest, I didn't buy that house to prove anything to my family. I bought it because I'd spent 5 years sleeping in a Honda Civic, and I wanted finally to sleep somewhere with a locked door I owned myself. While I was building that, Ember and Oak was quietly falling apart, though I only learned the details later, mostly secondhand through my cousin Marisol, who still spoke to my parents regularly. The boutique had opened strong, riding the launch party momentum, but Priscilla had no functional understanding of inventory margins or vendor contracts. She overordered custom glass jars from a supplier in Vermont, underpriced her candles to compete with a national chain that opened 2 blocks away, and began running "closing soon, everything must go" sales that never actually closed anything, just bled the business slower instead of faster. Within 2 years, she owed roughly $70,000 to 3 separate vendors. My parents, rather than letting the business fail the way any first-time entrepreneur's project reasonably might, mortgaged Greenridge Lane a second time to inject another $110,000 into it. It still wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough because the problem was never capital. The problem was that nobody in that store had ever been taught what happens when the money runs out. That's when the phone calls to me started, roughly 5 years after I'd walked out with $300 in my pocket. My mother, calling on a Sunday evening, her voice syrupy in a way I hadn't heard directed at me since childhood. "Owen's doing so well," she said, like she was reporting news to me about myself. Maybe he could help his sister out, just a little. I said no. I said it calmly, without raising my voice, and she acted wounded, like I'd slapped her through the phone. "She's your sister, Owen. Family helps family." I reminded her gently that family hadn't extended that principle to me 5 years earlier, standing in that kitchen with a duffel bag. She had no answer for that. She just sighed and said I'd changed. The first real ceiling broke about 6 weeks after that call. I was reviewing my accounts one evening, a habit I'd kept religiously since the warehouse days, when I noticed a withdrawal of $15,000 from an old joint account my father had opened when I was 18, technically titled under both our names "for emergencies," a formality I'd forgotten even existed. The transfer went directly into a business account belonging to Ember and Oak. I called my father immediately. He answered on the second ring, calm, almost bored. "We needed the money," he said, like this explained everything. "We'll pay it back, Owen, don't be dramatic about it." "You stole from me," I said. "I borrowed it," he corrected, his voice hardening. "You've got villas and software companies now. You can't even feel 15 grand missing." That sentence told me everything about how he'd recalibrated our relationship in his head. My success hadn't earned me respect. It had simply reclassified me as an ATM that didn't require a conversation before withdrawal. I froze every account tied to my name that still had any connection to my parents, closing the old joint account entirely within 48 hours. That should have ended it. It didn't. 2 weeks later, Marisol called to tell me Priscilla had been telling mutual family friends that I was hoarding money while our parents lose everything, a narrative that spread through extended family group chats faster than I could correct it, framing me, the son who'd been thrown out with $300, as the villain withholding help from people who'd never once helped me. I drove to Greenridge Lane the following Saturday, my first time back inside that house in nearly 2 years. Priscilla sat at the kitchen table scrolling her phone, not even bothering to look up when I walked in. "The prodigal son returns," she said, smirking at her screen. "What's 50 grand to you, honestly? You've got a beach house." I told them flatly that I'd already filed a fraud report with my bank regarding the $15,000 transfer. My father's face went red immediately, the color climbing from his collar to his hairline. "That could ruin her business, Owen. Do you understand that?" "Good," I said. It was the first time in my adult life I'd said something that direct to him, and the silence silence that followed felt like the room itself was recalibrating. Priscilla stood up so fast her chair scraped loud against the tile, grabbed a glass off the counter, and threw it at the wall beside my head, close enough that a shard cut a thin line across my ear. My mother screamed, not at Priscilla for throwing it, but at me, asking what I'd done to provoke her like that. I left that house with blood drying on my collar and a clarity I hadn't had in years. Whatever version of my family I'd been quietly hoping still existed, waiting to reassemble itself into something functional, didn't exist. It had probably never existed. I'd just been too invested in the idea of it to see the evidence clearly. The real turning point, the piece that recontextualized everything, came about a month later, and it started with an unlikely phone call. A woman named Teresa Vance, who'd worked the register at Ember and Oak for 2 years before quitting that spring, called me directly. She'd found my number through Marisol, she explained, because something had been sitting wrong with her for months, and she finally wanted to say it out loud to someone who could actually do something with the information. 18 months earlier, she told me, Priscilla had needed emergency capital to cover a vendor default, roughly $200,000, and had gone to a private regional lender that specialized in small business bridge loans. The lender had required a co-signer with strong credit and verifiable assets. Priscilla didn't have one. Our parents' credit, already strained from 2 mortgage refinances, wasn't sufficient either. So, according to Teresa, who had personally witnessed the paperwork being prepared in the store's back office one evening after closing, Priscilla had signed my name to the co-signer documents, forged my signature, notarized through a friend of a friend who apparently hadn't checked identification closely enough, and submitted loan paperwork worth $200,000 using my name, my social security number pulled from an old tax document our mother had kept in a filing cabinet, without my knowledge, without a single word to me about any of it. I sat with that information for exactly one night before calling a lawyer the next morning. I filed a formal fraud report with the lending institution and with local police the same week. Investigators pulled the signature samples, compared them against verified documents I provided, and confirmed within 11 days what Teresa had already told me. The signature on the loan wasn't mine. It wasn't close. Priscilla's accounts, personal and business, were frozen pending investigation almost immediately once the lender was notified of the fraud claim. Ember and Oak, already hemorrhaging money, couldn't survive the freeze. The store closed permanently within 2 months, the storefront on Water Street sitting empty with a for lease sign propped crooked in the window by early autumn. My parents didn't speak to me for 4 months after that. I didn't reach out to bridge the silence, and I want to be honest about why. It wasn't spite. It was that I finally, at 31 years old, stopped performing the role of the family member who chases reconciliation regardless of what's done to him. I let the silence sit. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I slept through the night without my mind circling back to some unresolved argument from Greenridge Lane. I finally breathed fully, inside a home I actually owned outright, with no one's name on the deed but mine. That peace lasted almost exactly 8 months. It was a Tuesday evening in late September when a silver Lexus, clearly a few years old and in need of a wash, pulled slowly into my driveway like it didn't quite want to be seen arriving. I watched from my kitchen window as my parents stepped out first, my father moving slower than I remembered, my mother smoothing her blouse with both hands before she'd even fully closed the car door. Then Priscilla emerged from the back seat, sunglasses on despite the fading evening light, her posture smaller than I'd ever seen it. My mother called out toward the house, her voice bright in a way that didn't match the tightness around her eyes. Owen, this place is beautiful. I let them in anyway. I want to be honest that some small, stubborn part of me still wanted to know what they'd come to say, even knowing, on some level, exactly what it would be. Priscilla took off her sunglasses once we were seated in my living room. Her eyes were red-rimmed and hollow in a way that looked less like performance and more like genuine exhaustion, though I'd learned by then not to trust my first read on her expressions. I lost everything, she said, her voice cracking on the word everything. I'm staying with Mom and Dad now. I don't have anywhere else. Then, after a pause clearly calculated to let that land, she asked if I'd consider partnering with her on a new boutique, an eco-friendly concept this time, sustainably sourced candles and home goods, a market she insisted was different from the one that had swallowed Ember and Oak whole. I almost laughed out loud, and I'm not proud of how close I came to actually doing it. You forged my name on a $200,000 loan, I said, keeping my voice level. You nearly got me criminally investigated for fraud I didn't commit. And now you want to go into business with me? My father leaned forward on the couch, his elbows on his knees, the posture of a man about to deliver a lecture he believed was reasonable. She's learned her lesson, Owen. Show some compassion for once in your life. For once in your life, as if the last 5 years of compassion I'd extended, quietly, without applause, hadn't existed at all in his memory. I asked, out of genuine curiosity more than cruelty, where exactly she planned to open this new store. My old location, she said, some of her old confidence creeping back into her voice. It's still sitting empty downtown, right? Water Street. I told her, as plainly as I could manage, that I'd bought that building myself 3 months earlier through a small real estate holding company I'd set up the previous year for exactly this kind of opportunistic acquisition. She went white, the color draining out of her face almost instantly. My mother's voice shook when she finally spoke. You can't do that to your own sister, Owen. I already have, I said. Priscilla stood up so fast she nearly knocked over the side table beside the couch. You think this makes you powerful? She demanded, her voice climbing slamming toward the pitch I remembered from the glass-throwing afternoon. "No," I said, and I meant it fully when I said it. "It makes me free." She stormed toward my front door and slammed it hard enough that a framed photograph, one of the few personal items I'd hung on my walls, a picture of the Wrightsville Pier at sunrise from my warehouse years, fell straight off its nail and cracked against the tile floor. My mother lingered a moment longer near the doorway, tears standing in her eyes, unwiped. "You've changed, Owen," she said quietly. "You're right," I told her. "I have." Then I closed the door behind them, and I picked the broken glass up off my floor with my bare hands, careful and unhurried, and I didn't feel a single thing I'd have called regret. The weeks that followed brought a kind of quiet, complicated satisfaction I hadn't expected. Word travels fast in a small coastal business community, and once the fraud investigation and subsequent conviction, Priscilla eventually pled guilty to a reduced charge of financial identity fraud and received 18 months probation plus restitution, became known among local landlords. Commercial leasing along the coast dried up for her almost entirely. Nobody wanted to rent retail space to a woman with a fraud conviction attached to her name, regardless of how sustainably sourced her candles claimed to be. She called me twice that month, leaving voicemails that alternated between pleading and vaguely threatening, asking me to intervene with landlords I supposedly had connections to. I never called back. I'd learned, finally, that responding to Priscilla was simply another form of feeding whatever it was in her that needed to keep pulling from other people, rather than build anything of her own. Then, in early November, a letter arrived from a real estate attorney I didn't recognize, informing me that my parents had listed Greenridge Lane for sale, the house I'd grown up in, the house I'd once handed $400 a month toward saving from foreclosure, and asking, almost as an afterthought at the bottom of the letter, whether I might be interested in purchasing it myself to keep it in the family. I sat with that letter for a full day before making a decision. I called my own lawyer the next morning and instructed her to make a full cash offer, above asking, with a 14-day closing window. The deed transferred into my name within 17 days total, faster than my parents, according to Marisol, even fully processed what had happened. My parents' response wasn't to call me directly. They sent Priscilla to my door instead, mascara smeared down both cheeks in a way that looked, this time, genuinely unrehearsed. "They're losing everything, Owen," she said, her voice thin. "Please, just come talk to them, just once." Against my better judgment, maybe out of some last residual thread of obligation I hadn't fully cut yet, I agreed to go the following afternoon. The porch light at Greenridge Lane hung crooked when I arrived, a detail that struck me harder than it probably should have, given how carefully my father used to maintain that house. The yard had gone overgrown, the hedges my mother once trimmed every other Saturday now shapeless and wild. Inside, my mother sat in the living room clutching a mug of tea that had clearly gone cold, untouched, her hands wrapped around it more for something to hold than for warmth. My father sat across from her, staring at the floor, looking smaller and grayer than I remembered him being even 8 months earlier. "We were hoping," my mother started, her voice barely above a whisper, "maybe you'd consider helping us buy the house back. We could work something out. Payments, maybe." I told her, as gently as I could manage given the circumstances, that I already owned it outright. My father's face drained of whatever color it had left. "You bought it out from under us?" he said, his voice cracking on the last word. "I think it's poetic," I said, and I did think that, genuinely, without any real cruelty behind the thought. My mother began to cry in earnest then, reaching across the space between us for my hand, and I stepped back before she could touch me, not out of anger exactly, but because I understood finally and completely that comfort from me at that moment would only reset the pattern one more time. That's when my father stood up from the couch, his whole body shaking with something that looked like it was caught between rage and genuine fear, and he opened his mouth to say the one thing that told me, immediately, that none of this was anywhere close to over. "You think you're better than us now," he said, his voice rising unsteadily, "but everything you have, every dollar, came from opportunities this family gave you. The connections, the name. You'd be nothing without us, Owen, and someday you'll understand that the hard way." I stood in the doorway of the house I now legally owned and listened to my father insist that a childhood of being told I was wasting space, of $300 folded on a counter, of watching $1 million leave the family for a business that failed twice over, had somehow been the foundation of everything I'd built. I didn't argue with him. There was nothing left to argue. I simply said, "I hope you find some peace here, Dad. I mean that." Then I left, and I let the crooked porch light and the overgrown hedges be the last image I carried of that house as anyone else's problem but mine to eventually fix, on my own schedule, if I ever chose to at all. It's been almost 2 years now since that final conversation on Greenridge Lane. I still own that house, though I've never moved back in or sold it. I pay a property management company to keep the lawn cut and the porch light fixed, mostly I think, because some part of me isn't ready to let it fall apart entirely, even if I'm also not ready to forgive what happened inside it. My parents rent a small apartment across town now, funded partly by my father's modest pension, and partly, I later learned through Marisol, by a small stipend Priscilla sends them from a retail job she took at a home goods chain, the kind of steady, unglamorous work that never once interested her when $1 million was available instead. I don't speak to Priscilla. I don't speak to my parents, beyond a card at Christmas that I send more out of habit than warmth, and that I've never once received a reply to. I've made peace with that silence, mostly. It doesn't ache the way it used to on quiet nights at the villa, looking out at the water I once slept beside in in a car with an eighth of a tank of gas. I think about that kitchen table sometimes. The confirmation page my father printed like a trophy. The $300 folded once and left on the counter like a tip for services no longer required. I used to think success would feel like proving them wrong. It doesn't. Not really. It feels quieter than that, and sadder too, in a way I didn't expect. Because what I actually wanted, underneath all of it, wasn't a beachfront villa or a software company or the deed to a childhood home. It was simply to matter to the people who raised me, without having to earn it first. That's the part that never came. And building an empire from nothing doesn't fill that particular gap, no matter how large the empire eventually grows. I built a life I'm proud of, out of a duffel bag and $300 and a stubborn refusal to disappear the way they expected me to. But some nights, standing on my own boardwalk watching the tide come in, I still miss the family I never actually had. And I've learned slowly that both things can be true at once. I got everything I built. I lost something I never really had to lose in the first place. And I've stopped waiting for anyone from that kitchen table to notice the difference.